Hello, America and the world. This is Radio Free Market, and I am your host, Michael McKay. We are behind the lines of socialism, my friends, and Radio Free Market is the voice of free people and free markets. Our topic today is Strange Bedfellows, How Enemies Unite Against Liberty, with Dr. Mark Thornton. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Michael. Glad to be here.
I'm really glad to have you back with us. So, everyone, I want you all to know that Dr. Mark Thornton is a senior resident fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. He is also a former professor of economics at Auburn University and Trinity University in Texas. Today, specifically, I'm going to refer you to his book, The Economics of Prohibition, which you will find featured in our Radio Free Market website under our education section. And I also want to plug Mark's recent, very important work, which he painstakingly edited. It's titled An Essay on Economic Theory, which was written by Richard Cantillon in 1730. This is a very important work, and I feel that all students of economics or people that are interested in understanding economics should definitely obtain this book and read it. It's a very, very important piece of scholarship and literature. So I also want to welcome back Mr. Christopher Opperman. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Okay. So our listeners are going to recognize Chris as one of our special commentators who today is co-hosting the show with me. Chris is an undergraduate student at Harvard, and I met Chris while we were both attending Mises University in 2009. Chris has also been a summer intern at the Acton Institute. And I would like to invite our listeners to be on the lookout for Chris's articles and works over the many years to come. I think, gentlemen, this topic is a very, very important subject of how enemies unite against liberty. And I've noticed how seemingly, or actually, opposing forces can create a partnership and reduce the freedom of choice of everyone in society. On the surface, this seems bizarre, but as you have brought out, Mark, this is really quite understandable. So, Chris, I'm going to ask you to please start off today with your first question for Dr. Thornton.
Yes. Well, Dr. Thornton, you've dedicated a lot of your scholarly output to studying the history and the economics of alcohol and drug prohibition. So, as many of our listeners might know, there was recently a ballot initiative in California, Proposition 19, and it attempted to liberalize restrictions on the consumption of marijuana. So, Dr. Thornton, can you explain to us a little bit in further detail kind of the background and the fate of Proposition 19?
Yes, Proposition 19 was a ballot initiative in California which would have essentially legalized the production, distribution, and consumption of marijuana in the state of California. And that flies directly in the face, of course, of federal legislation and even international treaties and agreements to keep drugs illegal. And the measure was widely followed in the media. Many people expected it to pass, but ultimately it failed to pass, but it did receive 46% of the vote. So when I look at it, I think that's a substantial victory, that 46% of the people would stand up and defy federal law, defy international treaties. And the reason, of course, that it was defeated is because there was so much opposition to Proposition 19. Opposition at all levels, from the highest reaches of government to law enforcement. And I actually explain why the measure went down to defeat using a political model developed by Professor Bruce Yandel, which he called Baptists and Bootleggers. And in this model, he explains how that Baptist preachers and bootleggers are two very different classes of people, but when it comes to prohibition, they both share a single interest in keeping alcohol illegal.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you right now, Mark. Unfortunately, we're coming into our first break, which comes up way too quickly in the show. But when we come back, folks, we'll be talking with Dr. Mark Thornton more about these bootleggers and Baptists and have him explain this a little bit further for us. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and Michael McKay here, hosting our show with Mr. Christopher Opperman, and we're interviewing Dr. Mark Thornton on the strange bedfellows of how enemies unite against liberty. And just before the break, Mark, you were talking about Bootleggers and Baptists, and I know that Chris wanted to bring this question out a little bit more. Go ahead, Chris.
Sure. Well, Dr. Thornton, I noticed that you actually brought up this concept in a recent Mises.org article, so it's there for our listeners to go check out. But you were talking about this concept that economist Bruce Yandel, who used to be the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, brought up, and it is this concept of bootleggers and Baptists, kind of unexpected allies when it comes to certain economic policies. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this concept. I mean, who are the Baptists and who are the bootleggers?
Well, of course, as I was pointing out, they both share this interest in keeping something illegal. In the case of the Baptists and the bootleggers, it's alcohol. In the case of marijuana, the people opposed to it were, of course, the politicians, all the big state government politicians, the Attorney General of the U.S., the governor, and so on. Even the presidents of Mexico and Colombia, the two drug-producing nations, came out against this. Now, if we look at the evidence on the ground, the bootleggers in this case, first of all, are the local marijuana growers in California who make a tremendous amount of money by growing marijuana largely in what's called the Emerald Triangle, the marijuana-producing counties of Northern California. And so they're part of the bootleggers in this case. And also you have the California beer and beverage distributors coming out against this, providing money to opposing Proposition 19. So those sorts of groups represent the bootleggers. They don't want to see legal marijuana because the marijuana growers would then be forced to sell their product at a much, much lower price. And, of course, the beer distributors, they don't want to see low-priced marijuana because that would compete with beer and other forms of alcohol. So those are the bootleggers. The Baptists, on this account, of course, are the churches, the typical fundamentalist Christians who oppose just about everything along these lines and are willing to drop freedom and drop liberty for the slightest reason. There was also a group called Vision to America, which was a fundamentalist Christian group that used their mailing lists to raise money in order to go against Proposition 19 and to run ads, which were basically distortions and non-truths. They were saying that marijuana would be used by truck drivers, by nurses going into operations, even in the schools, of course, and none of that is true. Students can be prevented from consuming marijuana. Nurses, of course, can be prevented from consuming marijuana, especially before or during work. Truck drivers can be prevented from using marijuana. Airplane pilots, all sorts of people. Even if it's legal, it doesn't mean that you can do it any old time that you want. Okay, so employers...
That's a very important point.
And it's much in the same way that alcohol is regulated today.
Oh, absolutely. Businesses and institutions, they regulate themselves. I mean, churches, didn't allow smoking cigarettes before they were prohibited in public places. Lots of restaurants and convenience stores have signs out front that says no shirt, no shoes, no service. Okay, so... Right. Businesses and institutions, they have their own rules, and they enforce them perfectly fine. And there's no reason that government has to ban a product completely in all aspects of society comprehensively, because institutions, individuals, firms all have their rules. Insurance companies sure as heck wouldn't allow companies that operated heavy machinery and dangerous equipment, they wouldn't allow their employers, the employees, to consume marijuana or alcohol or anything else. And so just because we say something is legal doesn't mean it's going to be used indiscriminately.
I want to jump in here because you make a very, very important point that regulators unintentionally give benefits to those who circumvent the regulations and prohibitions. And I was thinking about this, that regulators basically create market participants who are in reaction to regulation.
Oh yes, I mean it's just one of the many pitfalls of having government regulations and government bureaucracies in following these comprehensive rules that don't actually apply very well to the individual circumstances throughout the entire country. And
just jumping back into this conversation that we were just having, you take your no shoes, no shirt, no service kind of thing. That's a business by business basis. That's a business that can actually decide that. And when you have a business by business basis of regulation, so to speak, as opposed to this blanket of regulation that is imposed on all of society, then you're not going to have these market participants that are going to unite together and create infrastructure so that they can basically go into a restaurant without their shirt on. They're having an individual business or individual businesses being able to actually say, no, you can't smoke here, or you can't come in here without shoes or whatever. It actually prohibits or dramatically inhibits the possibility of creating networks of violators or networks of people that are trying to circumvent regulation. Would you comment on that?
Yes, I remember going into a convenience store on the beach one summer, and it had a sign out front that said, no shirt, no shoes, come on in. Because that was just local circumstances. People were at the beach. They didn't have shoes, they didn't have shirts, and this business was open, open for their business. And so, that's the private sector responding to this local circumstances where government regulations indiscriminately and comprehensively limit freedom across the entire nation. And it's just an un-American way of looking at things. It's an un-American way of doing things. And I think prohibitions are the ultimate form of government intervention. It was one of the reasons why I went into this area of research, because as Rothbard points out, a lot of what government does are prohibitions. They're little nitpicky prohibitions that exist throughout the entire federal and state government bureaucracy. It's just that we're more familiar with alcohol prohibition and drug prohibition because they're isolated, in a sense, in our own minds and in reality, whereas the government actually imposes all sorts of prohibitions. And so, the great thing about California legalizing marijuana is that it could start a tidal wave towards liberty. Mm-hmm. And by that, basically, I mean that, if we legalized marijuana in California and everyone, of course, expects it not to really change society for the worse, that it's going to change society for the better. It's going to do things like decrease alcohol consumption. It's going to decrease the consumption of other more dangerous drugs. And by being a vote of the people against federal law and international law, I mean, it could set an example of how well liberty works and how poorly government prohibitions work. So this is something that once ignited in California, and it's going to go on the ballot next time, it could go national, whereas other states start standing up to silly federal laws, silly state laws, harmful laws, and so this thing could go national. It could ultimately result in the decriminalization of other drugs and even other things that are currently prohibited, that we're currently prohibited from doing, and which is all setbacks to liberty and the free market. And ultimately, of course, we'd like to see this trend go worldwide, because the harm that drug prohibition does in the United States does not stop at the border. The crisis in Mexico, at the Mexico border, where thousands of people have been killed as a result of the illegal drug business. Colombia, where the nation is on the brink of meltdown, and other places around the world. If you look at the hot spots around the world, like Lebanon, like Afghanistan, Colombia, other places in South America, those areas of ferment and violence got started because of the fact that drugs are illegal in the United States, and they just happen to be the producing countries, and as a result, we've helped undermine local society and government with our drug war that we've since sponsored and created a worldwide network of drug prohibition.
Right. It's part of our culture at this time. I'm going to actually jump in again because you mentioned a term a minute ago, decriminalization. Now, there is a distinction between decriminalization and legalization. And there is actually, we were talking, Chris and I, in the formation of this the show about the examples in Portugal, for example, that they still have the laws on the books, but they have decriminalized it to the point to where they've reduced their problem there. So we're running into the into our next break segment of this segment, and so we're going to have to pick up this thread when we get back. And so unfortunately I can't let you reply to that at this moment, Mark. But everyone, please stay with us. This is Michael McKay, and with me is Chris Opperman and Dr. Mark Thornton, and we'll be right back as we talk a little bit more about strange bedfellows, how enemies unite against liberty. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.